All right, in this video, we're going to talk about behavioral observations. So, behavioral observations is commonly used as a form of behavioral assessment, assessing how a person, most in our case, a student, how is that student behaving. So, it's different than other forms of behavioral assessment. A lot of them which rely on people's perception of behavior, right? Filling out those checklists, questionnaires, interviews, things like that. A behavioral observation involves watching and recording the behavior of a person or a student in a typical environment, right? Like a classroom. So the assumption is that the data collected is going to be objective, right? When I'm a teacher and I fill out the checklist for a student, it's objective, right? It's it's more it's going to be kind of my perception of that student. So most methods of behavioral observation provide quantitative and objective data that can be used to determine current levels of behavior, to set goals for behavioral improvement, and to measure change following intervention plans. So by having a professional observe that student, they are going to measure those changes that took place after the behavioral intervention plan. It's also going to help them set up goals to improve that behavior. And they can also be used to determine current levels of behavior as well. What they're going to be looking for is frequency. So first they're going to be, what is the behavior and the frequency of that behavior? How often does it occur? What causes that behavior? The duration, how long does it last? So let's go into the different methods for behavioral observations. One is anecdotal recording. So in this method, the methods are going to produce, but this is one exception to the others that are going to produce that objective and quantifiable data, because it's anecdotal recording. It involves someone recording and interpreting a behavior during an observation period. So when this is conducted, the observer records all behaviors observed, along with what was observed to occur before and after the behaviors. So what was the student doing before the behavior? What was the student doing after the behavior? And for this type of observation, it's very important that only observable behaviors are recorded, right? You have to observe the behavior that you're seeing. You can't infer behaviors that are taking place. You have to observe what's going on. Another method would be interval recording methods. So interval recording methods produce a record of the number of intervals during which a behavior is observed to occur. So there are three basic variations that involve interval recording. The first one is partial interval recording, whole interval recording, and momentary time sampling. But all these are going to focus on the frequency that a behavior is occurring. So the first one, partial interval recording, this begins with the observer determining the size of the interval needed. The size of the interval is going to depend on the nature of the behavior, but 30 seconds is a common choice. So the observer creates a grid of boxes on a sheet of paper. Each box represents one interval. The observation is conducted without the assistance of any computer. A stopwatch is typically used, set it for 30 seconds, and then you're checking off the behaviors as you go. So the observer is going to observe the student or the client, whoever it might be, and then after the interval is passed, the observer records whether the behavior occurred during the interval. If behaviors are recorded on a piece of paper, an X or a check mark is going to be put in the appropriate box if that observer saw that behavior. And I've never done one of these, but another special education teacher in my school, she did one, and we had a conversation. And she had, just like it described there, she had lots of boxes, and and I believe her interval was 30 seconds as well. So every 30 seconds, she was checking off the behavior. So if the student did that, she would make an X. If the student didn't, she wouldn't. Whole interval recording, it's very similar to partial interval recording in all aspects except for one. In partial interval recording, the behavior is recorded as having occurred by placing the X or the check in the box if it was observed to occur at any point during the interval. But in whole interval recording, the behavior has to have occurred throughout the entire interval in order to be recorded as having occurred. And then let's go into momentary time sampling. So in this one, a grid is constructed with each box representing one interval. The observer is going to start the observation by starting a timer, and then momentarily will observe the student or client at the end of the interval. If that behavior was observed at that moment, the observer is going to put an X in the box, but the next interval immediately follows. So the major difference between interval recording and time sampling is that in interval recording, all behaviors that are observed during the interval are recorded. In time sampling, only behaviors that are occurring at the end of the intervals are occurring. So keep in mind, momentary time sampling, it's only what's happening at the end of the time sample. Something else that's common is event or frequency recording, and hence the name. This typically involves recording the number of times a behavior is observed to occur during an observation period. Duration recording, and hence the name again. This involves producing an estimate of the amount of time a person spends engaged in a specific behavior. And the last one I have here is latency recording. So this is a very specific observation that provides information about the amount of time that elapses between an environmental event and the commencement or completion of a target behavior. So most typically this method is used to determine the amount of time it takes for a person to comply with a command. Okay? So those are many of the different observation methods that are used in a behavioral observation.